Welcome everybody. So miniature railways have been part of our railway scene since the turn of the last century. Long neglected by most enthusiasts, they have provided a train trip for countless thousands of happy passengers. Long after steam disappeared from the main line in Great Britain, miniature railways continue to have live steam locomotives hauling their trains. And our guest speaker tonight is Peter Scott of Minor Railways, and Peter will give us a big insight into early public miniature railways in Britain from 1901 to 1918. Peter, over to you.
Right. I think I'll take any questions, if that's okay, at the end, unless anyone's got a question that's particularly pertinent to what we're actually looking at. But otherwise, just please keep your questions to the end, if that is okay. Anyway, thank you for inviting me to give this talk. As you can see, the title slide says it all: Early Public Miniature Railways in Great Britain, 1901 to 1918. So we're looking at the very start of public miniature railways up to the end of the First World War. And I guess really, I'm not sure how many people are railway enthusiasts or know much about railways, but there's just a very short introduction to what a miniature railway is, and we have a few examples which I can show you. Perhaps the best known, or one of the best known miniature railways, is the Romney-Dymchurch Railway along the coast in Kent. Here we can see a view taken at Dungeness in 2019. This railway is 15-inch gauge and was built by a gentleman called Captain Howie in 1926. Really is his toy, a plaything. But it survived all the years, the ups and downs of the tourist industry in Kent, and today very successfully runs for about 13 miles. This view is at Dungeness, and in the background you can see one of the lighthouses. And on the right-hand side there is a new station which has been built in the last few years. The steam locomotive is one of the original locomotives built for the railway. Now you can find miniature railways at many different places. This particular view is at a place called Exbury Gardens, which is in the New Forest, not far from Bewley, in the grounds of Leo Rothschild, or the Rothschild family house and gardens, which are open to the public. And the idea of this railway, which is a 12.25-inch gauge railway, is to take people round the gardens and give them a view of the gardens without having them to walk round. So here we see a miniature railway which is being used as a transport function, so possibly for the less abled and the elderly to have a good look at the gardens and enjoy a ride behind a steam locomotive. This particular locomotive was built by a company in Devon, the Exmoor Steam Railway. It's called Mary Lou. Now, when our Queen died last September, there are a number of pictures going around which showed her on the footplate of this locomotive with a large grin on her face. So she obviously clearly liked riding on miniature railways. This view dates from 2019. Okay, this is the diesel miniature railway, 10.25-inch gauge in Paynton Zoo in Devon. Now it's sadly closed. Probably due to the pandemic, but mainly due to the cost of actually upgrading it. Here we see a diesel locomotive hauling a train, and again, it's just a short railway, about 500 yards around part of the zoo, which allows people a view of parts of the zoo which wouldn't normally be available to the public. So again, it's doing a sort of particular function. Piers have been very popular for miniature railways, especially in the post-Second World War era. This is Margate. It's actually the jetty of the harbour. The pier behind is the what you might call the real pier. This view dates from around 1951. The locomotive is a model of a Flying Scotsman. And interestingly, the driver there used to be a driver on the Southern Railway on the full-size trains. Now, just a few weeks ago, I visited the site of this railway, and virtually here's the same view. Concrete jetty. The pier behind is actually gone, got destroyed in a storm. And you can just see here, the metal bolt holes which actually bolted that track down to the pier along here. So that railway lasted from 1948 to 1963, just as a pleasure ride, taking people up and down the pier. This 10¼ gauge railway is in Reading. It ran alongside the Caversham along the Thameside Promenade. And I guess this picture, which was taken in the 1950s, tells you something about miniature railways. There's a young child clearly enjoying the locomotive, although actually the locomotive looks a little bit worse for the wear, with some missing paint on the smoke box door. Loco survives, but is now in France. And you'll find this is a recurring theme of miniature railway locomotives. They're easily transportable. So they don't only move around this country, they move around Europe and the world as well. The last typical miniature railway is a sort of railway which has been built by a modular engineering society to allow them to demonstrate and work their locomotives. So this is a railway with dual gauge, 7¼ inch and 5 inch, operating in Park and Norwich. And we have one probably no more than a mile where I'm sat now, in Prospect Park in Reading. So that gives you a brief introduction about what miniature railways actually are. And the content of this evening's talk is set out there. Public, we're talking about public miniature railways. Here, public means railways which are available for the general public to ride on. There'll be a brief note about gauges. I've already talked about a few already. And then we'll look at the very first miniature railways, which were private railways prior to 1901. We have a summary of the development of the public passenger carrying railway. And that's from the very first railway in 1901 up to the end of the First World War. And there's a bit of a schoolboy error there. Of course, that should say the end of the First World War in 1918, not 1914. Many of the earliest railways, as we see, were only laid down for the duration of various exhibitions. Now, exhibitions are very popular at the time. I suppose we could say they were started by the Great Exhibition in 1851, but they were quite popular and quite frequent up to the First World War, of all sorts of different types of exhibitions, usually for a few weeks or slightly longer. Railways or miniature railways were usually added as a novelty and attraction. Many of these details in many of these railways are at best sketchy and would benefit from further research. I perhaps should have said this, what the presentation you're seeing was a lockdown project, like so many of us had. Mine was just to research some of these very early miniature railways as best I could at the time. So just a brief note about gauges. The miniature railway is usually defined as having a gauge of 6 inches up to 15-inch gauge. Now, I'm assuming, or if you know what gauge actually means, it's the distance between the inside edges of the rails on a railway. A standard gauge, or the mainline railway in this country, is 4 foot 8.5. So the five most popular gauges, which we should be talking about, and we've already seen a few examples, and there are many others. These are just the main gauges. 15-inch gauge was popularised by a gentleman called Sir Arthur Hayward in the 1870s. He stated it was the smallest gauge which could be used for a commercial railway, and he was thinking about a landed gents estate for carrying perhaps timber, coal, or other materials around the estate, actually doing a job of work. But the gauge remains very popular for many miniature railways, especially the larger ones like the Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch we've already seen. 12 inches or 12.25, very few railways are built to this gauge until after the Second World War. and it's been very popular now from the 1990s. One of the reasons for that may be 15-inch gauge and above becomes within the purview of the Office of Rail Regulation or a Magistrates Railway Inspectorate. 12 inches and below does not, comes under different regulations, which may mean people are more keen to lay railways of a 15-inch size but with a slightly smaller gauge. 10¼ inch gauge was in use from around 1890 and became very popular for miniature railways in the post-World War II period. And we have a 9½ inch gauge, very popular Edwardian era for private railways, and there are very few public miniature railways of this gauge now in use. There's one in South Shields and one in the park in Matlock spring to mind. 7¼ has been very popular in recent years, but it actually dates right back to the 1900s. It's an easier gauge to work with, or rather, engines can be moved around quite comfortably in the boot of a large car. But it's a bit too small for a commercial railway carrying large numbers of passengers. So let's have an overview of gauges. Gauges, scale, the subject gets quite complex. You can have quite large engines at 7¼ inch and quite small engines at 15-inch gauge. It really depends if they're scaled or modelled on a particular locomotive, full-size one, or are just particularly freelance. And we shall see some examples as we move on. So private miniature railways up to 1901, these were built in the grounds of private grounds in the States. And the reason there was that the only people that had the money and space for such ventures. And it's still true today. If you want to build a miniature railway, you need space and you need money. So below we have a comprehensive list of known railways. And it seems the very first miniature railway built was 1843. So we're talking about the very early days of railways here, well before the Great Western Railway was built all the way to Bristol. And it was built by a gentleman called Lord Robert Rodney at Elsford in Hampshire. Now we know virtually nothing about this railway, don't even know its gauge. But there's a couple of brief reports in the Hampshire Chronicle of the time. And like so many railways, it closed on the death of the owner around 1864. 1865, we've already talked briefly about Arthur Hayward. He started with 9-inch gauge railway at his father's house in Derbyshire, before later moving to his own property and building a private 15-inch gauge railway to demonstrate his ideas about state railways. Moving on to 1866, Ardenglass in Loch Fyne in Scotland, as a railway of probably of a gauge around about 18 inches. Interestingly enough, for this railway, Queen Victoria visited in 1875, but sadly, we've got no idea whether she actually took a ride on the railway at the time. It'd be fascinating to know whether she did or she didn't. It closed around 1900. In the 1890s, a gentleman called Sir John Holder at Pit Marston, Moor Green in Birmingham instigated what became, as I've already mentioned, a very popular gauge, 10¼ and that was built at his home in Moor Green in Birmingham. 1893, the 6th Marquess of Downshire ordered an 18-inch gauge railway for his estate at East Hampstead Park in Wokingham. The railway didn't last terribly long, but the locomotive did last much, much longer and is still with us. A descendant later built a 10¼ inch railway in the war years in the same park. Now, the Duke of Westminster was about the only person to take up the Arthur Hayward's ideas of a practical 15-inch gauge estate railway, and he duly built the Eaton Hall Railway in Cheshire, which is a very large country estate, about a mile or a couple of miles long, this railway, and served the estate. Construction started in 1895 and it lasted up to the end of the Second World War. And it was really the most durable of all the estate railways. And the actual estate is open to the public on Bank Holiday Mondays, Easter, the 2 May holidays, and August holiday, and you can actually have a ride on a recreated part of the 15-inch gauge railway there. If you're ever in the Cheshire at the right time of year, it's definitely worth visiting. And there is a picture of the Duke of Westminster's Eaton Hall Railway, and you can see a fan of sidings there serving part of your state buildings. And there's some wagons there, probably for carrying things like coal, because the railway connected with a standard gauge Great Western Railway, and the coal was then delivered by rail and then transshipped to these wagons and then taken to the estate for use in the estate's boilers and other equipment. So moving on to the main topic, the centre topic of tonight's talk, the public miniature railways from 1901 to 1918. This was the very first one, so yes, based around an exhibition, the International Exhibition in Glasgow, held in 1901. And there you can see a lovely picture of the crowds on the railway and standing by in their Edwardian dress of the time. The driver here, to me, looks remarkably young. There's a child there with a mother, all lovely dressed up. And virtually everywhere on the course is wearing a hat. Now, this locomotive you can see hauling the train there was built in America by the Cagney brothers. They literally built thousands of these locomotives, and they were really built as train sets. So they would have supplied the track, the locomotive, and these coaches as a complete item. And they were supplied to showmen. And the idea was you laid it down at an exhibition or other event. It ran for the length of that event, and you took it up and you moved it somewhere else. Rather like showmen do today with rides and other things like that as well. So these are transportable railways, and they're designed as such. And that locomotive is relatively small, as we shall see later. So these locomotives went all over the world. And there's another view of the same railway. This railway is relatively simple, just about 160 yards of track laid in a straight up and down. You can see some of the exhibition buildings in the rear, and these lovely decorated coaches with what appears to be engravings or paintings on the side. At Blakesley Hall in Northamptonshire, a gentleman called Charles Bartholomew laid what was actually a private railway, but it comes within our selection here because he did open it for the village fete and other events for the people in the village. Now, this locomotive is very similar to the view in the previous picture, you'll notice, and it may well have been the same locomotive built by Cagney. The problem with these locomotives, and as for an historian, they're very difficult to identify. They didn't have numbers and generally didn't have names, and they're very much the same, although over the years there were a number of detailed differences. So here's a locomotive, and we have a couple of what appears to be a lady there keeping out of the sun under a tree. Yet another exhibition and yet another Cagney locomotive. So this is the International Exhibition of Arts and Industries at Alexandra Palace in 1903. This opened on the Saturday the 30th of May and ran for a number of weeks throughout the summer season. This is obviously a posed photograph. Everyone's nicely looking at the camera, and we have a nice lot of headgear to the fore again. Straw boaters and all sorts of headgear. Bricket Wood in St Albans, 1905, saw this railway opened. The area was called the Woodside Retreat. So probably a park or the same for people to enjoy themselves on a Sunday or during their free time. There appears to be some form of tent or marquee in the background there. And we have some track laid apparently on top of the grass, steam locomotive and two coaches. Now this was the first 10¼ inch railway, or public miniature railway, opened in this country. sorry, well, I should have said this is actually, I beg your pardon, this is a 12-inch gauge railway at the same location, opened a year later. And what the gentleman did, who was building this railway, George Flukes, he increased the gauge from 10¼ to 12-inch to give a bit more stability, which is probably a good idea when you look at these coaches here, with the passengers rather sort of precariously perched on these sort of garden seats on top. Probably not particularly stable. So 1905 saw the first permanent 15-inch gauge miniature railway opened in this country. That is as opposed to ones that have operated for a few weeks or months for an exhibition. This was constructed by a company called Miniature Railways of Great Britain Limited, which is set up by a gentleman called Bassett Loke, who you may be more familiar with model locomotives, smaller locomotives, and Henry Greenlee, who actually designed this locomotive. And this was this country's answer to Cagney. So this locomotive is called a Little Giant, and this railway opened on Whit Monday, the 12th of June 1905. It's formed of a circle of 430 yards of track. Now, the main snag with this railway was actually laid on the South Shore sands. Now, sand, moving parts of a steam locomotive and oil do not mix. And sadly, the line only lasted till 1909. Many people would discover later on building a seaside miniature railway near the beach causes all sorts of problems. The White City, very popular name for amusement parks and the like, but this one particular one was in Manchester in 1907. And here we see another Cagney locomotive running on a circular track. This railway opened to the public on Whit Monday, the 20th of May 1907. And this is obviously a 15-inch gauge railway. It ran round a lake in Parsifal Park. Not particularly successful railway. It's advertised for sale in 1909, but the amusement park remained open until 1928. The site was actually the former Royal Botanical Gardens in Manchester near Old Trafford. The Festival of Empire exhibition was held in Crystal Palace in 1910. And this miniature railway was built, not particularly good view, there's a bit of a muzzy photograph, but we see another Cagney locomotive. It was a very small, actually says the smallest train in the world, which I think is a bit of a overstatement probably, but it ran round the Great Fountain Basin on the second terrace at Crystal Palace. Now the intention was this should be 1910 to be this Festival of Empire exhibition, but sadly King Edward VII died on the 6th of May, not long before the exhibition was due to open. So it was actually delayed to 1911, but the railway did actually run that summer, 1910, for a number of events. And you can see on this postcard view, it also says, now running at Crystal Palace, Luna Park, Southend. Luna Park later became the Kersal in Southend. And this gentleman, W.H. Bond, also ran a railway on the beach at Skegness in the 1920s. Probably one of our two most well-known miniature railways, and indeed the most long-lived, both opened in 1911. This example is the Rill Miniature Railway, opened on the Monday, the 1st of May 1911, running for a mile around the marine lake in Rill near the seafront. And you can see here quite an extensive station with an overall roof and two of the Little Giant locomotives designed by Henry Greenlee there. And another good crowd, all posing for the camera. Now, the railway still runs today. It suffered a period of closure with the track removed between 1969 and 1978, mainly due to a disagreement between the then operator and the local council. But the group who operate the railway now have actually recreated that station. So just fix in your mind the station there with the central station writing across the top there. And this is the station they've actually recreated. Not exactly on the same site in Marine Lake, but the railway is virtually in the same position as it always was. You can just see Marine Lake away to the left-hand side there. And this railway runs all the way around in a circle. Now this locomotive here, Joan, a 15-inch gauge loco, was designed by Albert Barnes, who ran the railway in the adjacent amusement park for many years. He built about 6 of these locomotives. And on the right-hand side, just hiding under the canopy there, is a Cagney. Same gauge, but just see how much smaller the Cagney locomotive is compared with the Barnes loco there. So gauge doesn't always have relation to size. Now the other railway opened in 1911 was Lakeside Miniature Railway at Southport, and this railway is still running today and is our longest continuously operated miniature railway in this country. Apart from a period during the Second World War, it is run ever since 1911. Originally called Llewellyn's Miniature Railway after the then owner, it's been through a number of hands, but it's managed to survive. And here we see another little giant locomotive built by Miniature Railways of Great Britain Limited at the head of the train, and an enormous crowd actually watching. Of interest in here is this rather ornate building with this sort of carved or woodwork on the side there. This is the other end of the railway today, or I say today, actually in 2013, but the modern equivalent. Sadly, the railway is somewhat down at hill compared with what it used to be. You can see on this side here a disused platform, some overgrown tracks, rather reminiscent of the 1960s in this country on the mainline railway. In the background is Southport Pier, which actually runs across the top of the miniature railway. And this is a steam outline locomotive. In other words, a diesel locomotive, a diesel engine and a tender, built to look like a steam loco. But nevertheless, still carrying passengers. Moving on to 1913, the Liverpool Exhibition featured this railway, a colourised postcard here. The railway opened on the 22nd of May 1913 at Edge Lane and ran into October that year. And again, it was one of the amusements, or laid out as an attraction for visitors to the exhibition. So we have in the background a scenic railway, which was very popular at the time, effectively a roller coaster with this sort of fake rock pattern. But the main interest here is the miniature railway. We have a Cagney locomotive, which the person who colourised the postcard is painted coloured sort of red or maroon, which is probably unlikely. Virtually all the locomotives were turned out in a plain black. The driver in this photo here, in this postcard view there, you can compare to some of the earlier views we've seen, is probably the same man. So this engine and coaches, and indeed the driver, has probably moved between the exhibitions, just as the Cagney brothers intended when they designed it. We assume this gentleman here in his smart uniform is presumably supervising the operation of a railway. Again, 2 children of the time, very much in their dress of the period. Quite what this building is here, we can't quite see. It's something cottage. I'm not certain what that actually is. So the outbreak of the First World War on the 4th of August 1914 did not stem the opening of new miniature railways, although it did bring a halt to the large-scale exhibitions. We have to remember the difference between the First and the Second World War. The First World War had far less effect in this country. and many things and many businesses and people went about their normal business. This railway opened at Easter 1915 and saw the first public miniature railway, 7¼ inch miniature railway, to be opened at a place called the Beauty Spot at Ilkeston. It's a line of some 100 yards in length and was operated and built by Louis Shaw, who we see there with his luxuriant moustache and probably one of his children, possibly his wife behind, posed on the locomotive there. This line lasted throughout the war, but was removed over the 1923 season and taken to Mablethorpe on the east coast, where it ran for many years. The locomotive there is reminiscent of a mainline loco, so it's probably a scaled down version. So relatively small for a miniature railway, but quite able to pull the load you can see there of passengers. Now, remarkable as it might seem, 1915 actually saw the opening of one of the most well-known miniature railways in this country, the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway in Cumbria, in the Lake District. This was a venture of Bassett Lokes Narrow Gauge Railways Limited, a company that took over from Miniature Railways of Great Britain Limited, and it took over the disused 53-foot gauge mineral railway between Ravenglass and Eskdale, and they turned it into a miniature railway, as you can see here. And the first section opened on the 28th of August 1915. This loco was built in 1966 by Clarkson in York, and the view was taken relatively recently, just before the pandemic, on a lovely sunny day. Now, the same company, Narrow Gauge Railways Limited, in 1916 took over a 2-foot gauge horse-drawn tramway at a place called Fairbourne in North Wales, just across the estuary from Barmouth. And this railway opened in the early summer of 1916. Now, both this and the Ravenglass Railway are still in operation today. Now, sadly, Fairbourne is one of the places which, in due course, will be lost to the sea. The decision has been made not to maintain the sea defences forever there, so eventually this will be lost. We can see Barmouth in the background here. There's the estuary, and the railway's running on a section there, virtually on the beach. Another of the little giant locomotives there by Henry Greenley. Back in the 1980s, this railway was taken over and converted to a gauge of 12¼ And this view we can see here in typical North Wales weather is taken at Fairbourne, with a train waiting in Fairbourne station. Now, Fairbourne was effectively built as a tourist resort, really, by MacDougall of a flour fame. So those two railways bring us up to the end of the First World War period, the development we've been looking at this evening. But going on to the highlights of a post-World War One, the 1920s, I've already said, brought the Romney, Hyde and Dymchurch Railway, which remains with us today. And the 1930s, the North Bay Railway in Scarborough, which has quite an interesting history. In the 1920s and the 1930s, a lot of seaside resorts sought to, or local councils at seaside resorts, put a lot of investment into their resorts, whether it be bathing pools, boating lakes, promenades, and some actually installed a miniature railway themselves. which is what Scarborough Borough Council did. They installed this railway in the 1930s. And then post-Second World War, there was a boom in people visiting the seaside and tourist attractions, and that brought a big boom in miniature railways, especially 10.25-inch railways. There we are. Well, thank you very much. If you want any more information about what I've been talking about, there's my website there. And you can view on there, read the complete article of which this talk has been based. And there may be some other information or things there which might interest you if you found tonight interesting. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now if that's okay.
Yeah, that was great.
Yes.
Slightly shorter than I was programmed to, but I hope that's okay. If you've got any questions, yes, I can take them now.
I just wondered if you knew anything about the railway that we had at Butlins in Clacton post-war, which I think was probably about a 10-inch gauge.
Yes, I do actually. I've some years ago, I researched the history of all the Butlins railways and wrote a book. Clacton was interesting. I'm sure everyone remembers Heidi High. In the closing sequence, there's actually a sequence of a miniature railway. That is Clacton.
I thought so, yes.
Yeah, the railway was actually 2-foot gauge.
Was it?
Yeah,
it was live steam, wasn't it? I believe.
No, it was a steam outline.
Wasn't it? It was a steam outline. Oh, right.
Yes. Somewhere I've got many pictures of it, but the loco survives. It's actually on the Isle of Man at the moment.
Oh.
But it's typical of miniature railways. It was built in just after the Second World War. It ran at Huddersfield and Derby, various other places. Mm. But yes, if Butlins operated virtually a miniature railway, all their holiday camps.
Yeah, I think I went on it once when I was about 5.
Well, it's called a miniature railway, and I call it a miniature railway, although it's actually by definition narrow gauge. Mm. But as I say, gauge and scale, it all gets a bit controversial. So it's best to say if it looks like a miniature railway, it's like a duck. If it is, that's what it is.
Do you know have you seen the videos by a chap who goes under the name of Henry's Adventures on YouTube? I
have watched a few, yes, they're very good, yeah.
Yes, because he makes a point of going around to visit lots of the miniature railways, quite small ones, Yeah.
Yes, well, I've something I do myself as well. On my website, which I showed you there, you can there's a booklet which I publish every year, which is actually all the heritage standard gauge railways, right down to all the 7.25-inch railways, and there are about 520. If you want to visit them all, you've got to do more than one a day in a year.
Next question, John, you had your hand up first there.
Yes, thanks, Peter. Great talk. I in fact recommended you because I saw you give a similar talk in February last year, and it's very good and lots of additional stuff. I'm down in Hastings, so I'm fortunate in that I've got the Romney Highland Nymchurch Railway 10 or more miles away, and we also have one on the seafront and one in the Alexandra Park little railways. The Hastings Miniature Railway on the seafront, that's coming up to its 75th anniversary, so that's presumably 1948.
That's it. It's one of the post-Second World War, post-World War II railways I mentioned. It opened in St Leonard's in 1947, and I think the council were a bit sniffy about it, so they moved it to Hastings.
Oh, and right.
As you know, it's run successfully ever since.
Yes.
For some years, I think Ian Allen, the great trend spotter publisher, we had an interest in running the railway, but I think the gentleman who owns it now, could be Daniel Radcliffe, I think, is very much the enthusiast and has put a lot of money into it.
And I think he does repairs and new build for other railways, doesn't he? He's got a workshop.
He does indeed, yes. There's quite a lot of locos have been through his hands, absolutely, yes.
I've got one question. That's the picture of the Rill Railway. You mentioned the Cadme loco, very much smaller than the adjacent loco. I wondered if Cadme, because they made so many engines, did they do the same body and put them on different gauges?
Yes is the answer. I mean, I think the 15-inch gauge they call the Class D. The Class C was for some reason, was 12 and a 5/8 gauge. I'm not quite sure how they managed to get to that. They did turn out a 22-inch gauge version and possibly an 18-inch gauge version. So I assume they were scaled up. But I've always thought they were kept small, so they were portable.
Yes.
And they're quite powerful. I mean, don't let size sort of fool you. They could, pull a good number of people on a train.
And I suppose being designed to be portable, the actual surface on which it was laid could be quite steep at places, so it needed the power to get up any slight hills.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, most of the exhibition railways I talked about are probably no more than a couple hundred yards up and down to keep it nice and simple. But yes, I'm not sure how many they built. I mean, probably no one really knows. They never kept a proper inventory of all their locos, but we're talking of hundreds and hundreds throughout the world.
Very good. Thank you, Peter.
Cheers. Thank you.
Question from John Sharp.
Yes, thank you very much, Peter. Fascinating talk. I come from Huddersfield, and I am an engineer, mechanical engineer, and I've always been fascinated in railways, but I can't remember a miniature railway in Huddersfield. In Greenhead Park, the local Model Engineering Society had a railway, and I think that was 7 1/4, down to 3.5 inch, something like that. And that was just a straight track. I'm not aware of anything else.
I think Greenhead Park is still there, to my knowledge, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, still there. Yeah. Yes, the railway I briefly mentioned, which is the Butlins loco around at Huddersfield, was actually in Hope Bank Park.
Oh, yes, right.
Yes.
Yep.
We're talking of just a few years in the 1950s.
You're
but
quite
I think
right.
Hope Bank Park was one of these places with lots of attractions, wasn't it, I think?
Yes, it was developed as far as I can. Not quite sure when it opened, but it's to the south of Huddersfield in a place called Honley. And I remember going to Hope Bank after the war, but of course, eventually it just folded. But yes, that was quite a major attempt to create a sort of entertainment centre. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that railway I mentioned was there probably about 1951, 1952.
That's about right. Yeah,
that's it, and it used what later had turned up at Butlins at Clacton, same two coaches, same locomotive. So that's quite common with miniature railways. They get here, there and everywhere. They make for fascinating research.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
I have a question. In your discussion with Richard there, you were talking live steam and steam outline. Dumbwit here, what's the difference, please?
A steam is literally a locomotive powered by steam, boiler, pistons, cylinders, firebox. So a steam outline locomotive, somebody's made a internal combustion locomotive, petrol, battery, diesel, look like a steam locomotive. Oh. Sometimes the attempt is crude, as in the case of the Butlins loco. Sometimes with the North Bay Railway, it would be difficult from a distance to tell the difference. That's how good they are.
Thank you.
As you can imagine, a miniature railway, to be successful, needs to make money commercially, and you don't want to pay your driver too much. So if you can have a driver come along and just turn on the locomotive and drive it off, but it still looks the part for the children and visitors, that's far more attractive than having somebody specially trained to look after a steam loco.
So on that theme, the North Bay Railway, is there any live steam there at all?
Briefly, there was. The previous owner, who sold the railway, where are we now, about 3 or 4 years ago, did have a steam locomotive there, just for a couple of years. I think it only ran on high days and holidays, but otherwise it's steam outline, yep.
Yeah. Thank you.
And very attractive locomotives, in my opinion, but I'm biased.
Yeah, I was actually on that one in North Bay. I got the impression there was a lot of infrastructure around it. I think they had cable cars, or there was big pylons with cables linking the pylons. So whether it was some sort of a hair of the pants type of ride, or was just a standard cable car they were bringing people over the park or not, but that had all been disconnected the last time I was there, which is probably about 3-4 years ago, certainly before the pandemic, probably about 2018, 2019. But the trains are still going. I actually went from where we were into Scarborough itself, but it's still going strong.
Yeah,
It
still is. I mean, I think it was a chairlift. I think you're the one you're referring to. I'm not sure when it closed, but yeah, it went from North Bay, the top of North Bay, Scalby Mills, down to the park. Sort of similar route to the railway. But the railway was operated in, I can't remember the date now. It's probably sometime in the 1990s. Up to that time, from 1930, it was directly operated by the Borough Council, which is unusual, probably in modern times.
Yeah. So, have we got any more questions for our wonderful speaker tonight?
Yeah.
Howard? Howard, you're on mute.
Still on mute.
Howard, you're still on mute. That's it.
It's not coming up yet.
Yeah, you're okay, Howard. We can hear you now. No, you've gone mute again.
Difficult to make the thing go.
Yeah. You're on.
I think I'm on now.
Yeah.
Peter, the Eskdale and Ravenglass Railway you showed in 1915, is it the same locomotives that are still running on it now?
That's a difficult one. No, I think is a simple answer. Because I think they started off with some locos, probably little giant locos, that are a little underpowered for the line, which runs 8.5 miles up into the hills. So I think over the years they had a mixed motive power. But I think the simple answer is no, it's not the original locomotives.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Peter, it's John Sharp again. The North Bay Railway at Scarborough, I remember well. Now, just with your researchers, do you really have you really found out how those locomotives were driven? Because the tender appeared to have quite a powerful diesel engine in. Now, did the diesel engine drive the tender, or was there some form of mechanical coupling, you know, like a prop shaft, into the locomotive body itself?
Often I don't know. What I do know about those locos, they were the first railway locomotives in the world to have hydraulic transmission.
Yes, that's correct.
But I think you're right that the actual engine's in the tender. But I can't remember offhand if it drives the tender, or as you've just said there, whether it drives the driving wheels of the engine by some form of coupling. Because one of the locomotives I've actually got is a 464 tank locomotive, so the engine's actually in the locomotive, if that makes sense. The two locos that open the railway, Triton and Neptune, I should say Neptune opened the railway in 1931. Triton came a year later. For LNER lookalike locos, I think you're probably right, they drive through the tender. But it's not a railway I've actually researched in depth, although it's one of my, as you probably realise, it's one of my favourite railways, miniature railways.
Yes, it's a fascinating, and in fact, each locomotive, not Neptune and Triton, one is numbered 1931, and I think the other is 1932.
22. That's very popular of miniature railway locos to be numbered after the year they were built, which is quite useful for a researcher, as you can imagine.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I mean, I shall delve into Wikipedia after this.
That's dangerous.
Get to the bottom of it.
If you look at my website, there are 1 or 2 of the books I've written in years past, which you can download for free and read as a PDF. Not the North Bags, I've not actually researched that yet, but there are 1 or 2 others which you may find of interest. I'm not advertising because they're free, so.
Yes, I'm looking on your website now, Peter, and yeah, it's very good. And I see you also cover cliff railways, and you've got pictures of one of the cliff railways in Hastings. So I don't want to brag, but we've got 2 cliff railways as well.
Well, I think you have, I can't remember which of the 2 it is. You have the steepest one of the steepest ones in the country, I think. That might be East, I think it might be East Hill.
Yeah, the East Hill, and then the West Hill actually goes under a tunnel to get up to the castle at the top.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's also a message in chat from Clive Asquith. It said, "Many thanks, Peter, for a very interesting talk. I have to drop off now. I have a great interest in railways, especially narrow gauge. Regards, Clive." Clive did apologise in advance that he was going to have to leave early tonight, because with the knowledge Clive has on railways, I think this conversation would have went on till about 10:30 tonight. But yeah, I'm glad to see you put up all the details there on your website and everything, and I'm sure Clive in due course will actually access your website and have a look at all the details on there.
Yeah, the full article of the talk is effectively, with some of the pictures, is obviously on the website. Yeah.
Excellent. Any more talks, questions?
Got a question in from Alan. He's got his hand up.
Yeah. Yes, good evening. Thank you very much for an excellent talk. Thank you. Most enjoyed. I remember the Festival of Britain Railway in Battersea Park. I've been there time, and there was a West Street Railway, the based on Nemec line, and that street was by a thing that I had like Leslie Stifford. And answering sort of John Clark's question, I remember finding out later that the tenders had diesel engines in, which were actually ex-World War II searchlight generators, which then drove the by electric motors, the locomotive. So, yeah, I can't think I'm saying 1951.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. 1951, you are right. The locos were diesel electrics. They're actually built by the proprietor of the Lakeside miniature railway in Southport, which you saw during the presentation. A gentleman called Harry Barlow. He won the contract to run and operate the railway there.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that's yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, if there's no more questions, Peter, I think we've had, just gauged on the amount of questions we had there. You've presented a wonderful talk, and it's gone down very well with our people here. And I'm sure people will be accessing the video later on. They weren't able to make it tonight. That's the usual problem we have. So if you'd like to show Peter your appreciation in the usual way, please.
Yeah, sure.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm glad you found it of interest. And really, if anyone has got any further questions, my email address is obviously on the website. And yeah, I'm always interested to hear about miniature railways. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.